Family gatherings, the picnic that lasted 3 days. Auckland, New Zealand, surveying the sprawling property that had been in the Henderson family for 3 generations. The year 1917 did not brought with it a sense of renewal and hope following the end of the Great War, and Margaret felt it was time for something extraordinary, a family gathering that would bring together relatives scattered across New Zealand's North Island. At 42, Margaret was the unofficial matriarch of the Henderson clan, a position she had inherited not through age, but through sheer force of personality and an uncanny ability to organize even the most chaotic situations. Her husband, Thomas, often joked that she could coordinate a military campaign with nothing more than a tea service and her leather-bound address book. "Thomas," she called through the screen door, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Come see, this beautiful morning. It's perfect weather for planning." Thomas emerged from the house, still adjusting his suspenders and carrying a steaming cup of tea. At 45, he had learned that when Margaret spoke of planning, it usually meant their quiet life was about to become significantly less quiet. "Planning what, my dear?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Margaret turned to face him, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that had once convinced him to emigrate from Scotland to this distant corner of the British Empire. The family picnic, of course. But not just any picnic, something grand, something memorable, something that will bring everyone together for more than just a few hours. She gestured toward the expansive lawn that stretched from their house toward the small lake at the edge of their property. "Look at all this space we have. Why should we limit ourselves to a single afternoon? Why not make it a proper celebration? 3 days of family, food, and fellowship." Thomas nearly choked on his tea. 3 days. "Margaret, that's not a picnic, that's a festival. Where would everyone sleep? How would we feed them all?" But Margaret had already thought of that. She had been thinking of little else since receiving a letter from her sister-in-law in Wellington mentioning how scattered the family had become since the war ended. Sons had returned from Europe, changed, daughters had married and moved to distant towns, and the close-knit family gatherings of their youth had become increasingly rare. "We have the guest cottage, and plenty of room for tents on the south lawn," she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. "I've already made a list: the Hendersons from Rotorua, the MacLeods from Hamilton, the Campbells from Wellington, even cousin James from Christchurch said he might make the journey if we gave him enough notice." Thomas set down his teacup and took the list, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Margaret, this is nearly 50 people, and that's just the immediate family. 53, actually," she corrected with a smile. "I've been quite thorough." As Thomas studied the list, Margaret continued, outlining her vision. The first day would be for arrivals and settling in, with a simple welcome dinner by the lake. The second day would feature the traditional picnic activities, games, competitions, and a grand feast. The third day would be for farewells and the inevitable promises to not let so much time pass before the next gathering. "And you think people will actually come for 3 days?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to catch some of his wife's enthusiasm. "Thomas Henderson," Margaret said, taking his hands in hers. "We've just lived through the worst war in human history. Our boys came home, our family survived, and we have this beautiful place to share. If that's not worth celebrating for 3 days, then what is? Are you planning your own family gathering? Discover timeless tips for bringing loved ones together that have worked for generations. Learn how to create lasting memories that will be talked about for years to come." Thomas looked into his wife's determined eyes and knew that the 3-day Henderson family picnic was no longer a question of if, but when. "All right," he said, folding the list carefully, "but we'll need help. This is bigger than anything we've attempted before." Margaret's smile could have powered the electric lights that had recently been installed in their home. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Patterson about borrowing her large pots, and the Johnson boys said they'd help up setting up tents. Oh, and I thought we might ask Reverend Morrison to say a blessing on the Sunday, make it properly official." As they stood on the porch, planning what would become legendary in family lore. Neither Thomas nor Margaret could have imagined that their three-day picnic would indeed last exactly that long, but not quite in the way they had planned. The first challenge came that very afternoon when Margaret sat down to write the invitations. In mid-2020, communication across New Zealand's vast distances relied heavily on the postal service, and reaching everyone on her list would require careful timing. Some relatives lived in remote farming communities where mail delivery was sporadic at best. She decided on a formal approach, writing each invitation by hand on her best stationery. The Henderson family cordially invites you to a grand family gathering at Hillcrest Farm, Auckland. 3 days of fellowship, food, and celebration beginning Friday, March 15th. Into the accommodations provided. Please confirm attendance by return post. As she wrote, Margaret found herself remembering faces she hadn't seen in years. There was her nephew David, who had returned from France, with a limp but his sense of humor intact. Her cousin Sarah, who had scandalized the family by becoming a nurse and moving to the city. Uncle Robert, whose stories of the early days in New Zealand could entertain children for hours. Each name on the list represented not just a person, but a collection of stories, memories, and connections that had shaped the Henderson family identity. The 3-day gathering would be more than just a picnic. It would be a celebration of survival, resilience, and the bonds that held families together across time and distance. By evening, Margaret had written 27 invitations, her hand cramped but her spirit soaring. Thomas found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by addressed envelopes and a pot of tea that had long since gone cold. "You know," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "this might actually be the best idea you've ever had." Margaret looked up from her writing, ink staining her fingers, and a satisfied smile on her face. "Thomas, I have a feeling this picnic is going to be something special, something we'll all remember for the rest of our lives." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first guests arrived on Thursday afternoon, a full day earlier than expected. Margaret was in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough, when she heard the distinctive sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming up the long drive. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the front window, where she saw a sight that made her heart leap with joy and mild panic in equal measure. Uncle Robert MacLeod sat on the driver's bench of a heavily loaded wagon, his white beard flowing in the breeze, and his weathered face creased in a grin. Beside him sat his wife, Aunt Flora, and behind them the wagon was packed with what appeared to be half the contents of their Hamilton farm, along with 3 of their adult children and a collection of grandchildren whose exact number Margaret couldn't determine from the window. "Thomas," she called, not taking her eyes off the approaching wagon. "They're here. The MacLeods are here, and they've brought everyone." Thomas appeared at her shoulder just as Uncle Robert brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Oh, there, Margaret," Robert called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 40 years cowling cattle across vast paddocks. "Hope you don't mind us arriving a bit early. The weather looked good for traveling, and Flora was worried about the roads if it rained." Margaret stepped onto the porch, her mind racing. She had planned for early arrivals, but not quite this early, and certainly not this many at once. The wagon seemed to contain not just the MacLeods she had invited, but several additional family members whose presence, while welcome, would require some quick reorganization of her carefully planned accommodations. "Uncle Robert, Aunt Flora," she called back, her voice warm despite her internal calculations. "You're always welcome here, no matter when you arrive. Thomas, help them with their things." As the wagon's occupants began to disembark, Margaret realized that the MacLeods had interpreted her invitation as broadly as possible. In addition to Robert and Flora, there were their 3 sons, James, William, and young Robert, along with James's wife and 2 children, William's new bride, a surprise Margaret hadn't known about, and young Robert's girlfriend, whose presence suggested an announcement might be forthcoming. Margaret there, Aunt Flora said as she accepted Thomas's help down from the wagon. "I hope you don't mind, but we brought a few extra hands." The children were so excited about a proper family gathering, and well, you know how it is. Margaret did indeed know how it was. In families like theirs, invitations were often treated as suggestions, and the actual number of attendees could vary significantly from the original guest list. It was part of the charm and challenge of family gatherings. "Of course," Margaret said, embracing her aunt, "the more the merrier. We'll sort out the sleeping arrangements. The important thing is that you're here." As the MacLeods began unloading their wagon, Margaret noticed they had brought far more than personal belongings. There were baskets of preserves, wheels of cheese, sides of bacon, and what appeared to be a small barrel of something that Uncle Robert was handling with particular care. "What's in the barrel, Uncle Robert?" Thomas asked as he helped carry it toward the house. Robert's eyes twinkled. "A little something I've been saving for a special occasion. Figured a 3-day family gathering qualified." Margaret suspected the barrel contained something stronger than the lemonade she had planned to serve, but decided that was a concern for later. Right now, she needed to focus on the immediate challenge of accommodating 8 unexpected guests. The solution came from an unexpected source. Young Robert MacLeod, who at 22 was the most practical of his generation, surveyed the situation and made a suggestion that would set the tone for the entire gathering. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "what if we set up camp right here on the lawn? We brought tents, and the weather's fine. It'll be like an adventure, and it'll leave more room in the house for the older folks in the families with small children." It was a perfect solution, and one that transformed the arrival from a logistical challenge into the beginning of the celebration. Within an hour, 3 tents were erected on the south lawn, creating what young Robert dubbed Camp MacLeod. The children were delighted with the arrangement, and even Flora, who Margaret had worried might object to sleeping outdoors, seemed charmed by the novelty. Planning a multi-generational family event, learn the secrets of flexible hospitality that can turn unexpected challenges into cherished memories. Discover how to accommodate everyone with grace and creativity. As evening approached, more guests began to arrive. The Campbells from Wellington came in a motorcar, one of the few in the family, causing great excitement among the children who had never seen one up close. The Hendersons from Rotorua arrived by train and hired cart, bringing with them a collection of Maori artifacts that cousin Elizabeth had collected during her years teaching in the region. Each arrival brought its own small drama and joy. Cousin David limped up the front steps with the aid of a walking stick, his war wound still troubling him, but his smile as bright as ever. His sister Sarah arrived in her nurse's uniform, having come directly from her shift at Auckland Hospital, and immediately began fussing over everyone's health with professional concern and familial affection. By dinner time, the house and grounds were alive with conversation, laughter, and the controlled chaos that comes with any large family gathering. Margaret had planned a simple welcome meal, but the contributions from arriving guests had transformed it into a feast. The dining room table, extended to its maximum length, still couldn't accommodate everyone. So additional tables were set up on the porch and in the parlor. As they gathered for the meal, Reverend Morrison arrived, unexpectedly, having heard about the gathering from one of his parishioners. Margaret quickly set another place and welcomed him warmly, knowing that his presence would add a sense of occasion to the weekend. "Before we begin," the Reverend said, standing at the head of the main table, "might I offer a blessing for this gathering?" The conversation quieted as family members throughout the house and on the porch bowed their heads. "Heavenly Father," Reverend Morrison began, "we thank you for bringing this family together safely. We ask your blessing on this time of fellowship, and we remember those who cannot be with us, whether separated by distance or called to their eternal rest. May this gathering strengthen the bonds of love that unite this family, and may the memories made here sustain us in the days to come." "Amen," echoed through the house, followed by the gentle clatter of cutlery and the resumption of conversation. As Margaret looked around at the filled tables, the animated conversations, and the faces of family members she hadn't seen in months or even years, she felt a deep satisfaction. The three-day picnic was off to a perfect start, even if it wasn't quite going according to her original plan. Uncle Robert, who had been unusually quiet during the blessing, stood up and raised his glass of what Margaret now knew was his homemade whiskey. "To Margaret and Thomas," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the house, "for having the vision to bring us all together, and the courage to put up with us for 3 whole days." The toast was echoed throughout the house, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This was exactly what she had hoped for. Not just a gathering, but a celebration of family, connection, and the simple joy of being together. As the evening wore on, and the younger children were put to bed in various corners of the house, the adults settled into the comfortable rhythm of family storytelling. Uncle Robert regaled them with tales of the early days in Hamilton, when the land was still being cleared and the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. Cousin Elizabeth shared stories from her teaching days, including her efforts to bridge the cultural gap between Maori and European children in her classroom. David, despite his usual reluctance to discuss the war, found himself sharing some of the lighter moments from his time in France, the letters from home that kept spirits up, the makeshift celebrations in the trenches, and the profound gratitude he felt to be sitting around a table with his family once again. As the clock struck 10, Margaret realized that the first day of her 3-day picnic was nearly over, and it had been everything she had hoped for and more. Tomorrow would bring the planned activities, games, competitions, and the grand picnic feast. But tonight had already proven that the real magic of family gatherings lay not in the activities themselves, but in the simple act of being together. "Well," Thomas said, stretching and looking around at the contented faces, "I'd say day 1 has been a complete success." Margaret smiled, already looking forward to what tomorrow would bring. She had no way of knowing that day 2 would test every ounce of her organizational skills and family diplomacy, or that by day 3, the Henderson family picnic would have become something far more significant than anyone had imagined. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, with a light breeze that carried the scent of blooming pohutukawa trees across the Henderson property. Margaret woke before sunrise, her mind already racing through the day's planned activities. She had organized a series of traditional picnic games and competitions designed to engage family members of all ages and create the kind of friendly rivalry that would be talked about for years to come. The kitchen was already bustling when she arrived downstairs. Aunt Flora R. Reese in Orleans was directing a small army of family members in the preparation of what she declared would be a feast worthy of the occasion. Sarah had appointed herself head of safety and was organizing a makeshift first aid station, while the younger men were already outside, setting up the various competition areas under Thomas's supervision. "Good morning, dear," Thomas said, as Margaret stepped onto the porch with her first cup of tea. "The boys have been up since dawn, marking out the race courses and setting up the games. I think they're more excited about this than the children." Margaret surveyed the transformed landscape of their property. What had been simple lawn and pasture the day before now featured a series of activity areas, a long straight track for foot races, a field marked out for cricket, an area set aside for traditional Highland games, Uncle Robert's contribution, and near the lake, a space prepared for the afternoon's fishing competition. The first official event was scheduled for 9 o'clock, a series of foot races for different age groups. Margaret had learned from organizing church socials that starting with high-energy activities helped set an enthusiastic tone for the entire day. As family members finished breakfast and gathered on the lawn, she felt the familiar flutter of nervous excitement that came with any large event. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, standing on a wooden crate that Thomas had positioned for the purpose, "welcome to the first annual Henderson Family Olympics." The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd was gratifying, and Margaret felt her confidence surge. She had divided the competitions into age-appropriate categories, ensuring that everyone from 5-year-old cousin Mary to 70-year-old Uncle Robert could participate in something. The children's races came first, and Margaret watched with delight as the youngest family members lined up with the serious concentration of Olympic athletes. Little Mary MacLeod, Uncle Robert's granddaughter, had appointed herself the family's official timekeeper, despite the fact that she couldn't yet tell time. She stood at the finish line with Thomas's pocket watch, calling out random numbers with great authority. Ready, set, go. Call out James MacLeod, who had volunteered as the official starter. The children's race was a delightful chaos of flying legs, determined faces, and enthusiastic cheering from the adult spectators. Young Tommy Campbell, at 7 the eldest of the children's division, won by a considerable margin, but Margaret had wisely prepared ribbons for all participants, ensuring that everyone felt celebrated. The adult races proved more competitive than Margaret had anticipated. What she had envisioned as light-hearted fun quickly developed into serious rivalry, particularly between the MacLeod and Campbell branches of the family. Cousin David, despite his war injury, insisted on participating in the men's race, and his determination to overcome his physical limitations inspired cheers from the entire gathering. Looking to add excitement to your family gatherings? Discover classic games and activities that bring generations together and create friendly competition everyone can enjoy. The Highland Games, Uncle Robert's specialty, drew the largest crowd of them all. Robert had brought traditional equipment from Hamilton, including a caber, a large wooden pole for tossing, and stones of various weights for putting. The sight of grown men in their best clothes attempting to toss a telephone pole-sized piece of wood provided endless entertainment, particularly when William MacLeod's enthusiastic attempt sent the caber in an entirely unexpected direction, causing a general scramble for safety. Perhaps we should move the Highland Games further from the house, Thomas suggested diplomatically after the caber incident. Nonsense, declared Uncle Robert, who at 70 was still the most accomplished competitor. A little excitement never hurt anyone. Besides, it's all about technique, not just strength. To prove his point, Robert executed a perfect caber toss, the wooden pole flipping end over end to land in a straight line away from him. The applause was thunderous, and Margaret made a mental note to include Highland Games in all future family gatherings. The morning's final event was the cricket match, which had been planned as a casual game but quickly evolved into a serious contest between the Northern Alliance, the MacLeods and Hendersons from Hamilton and Rotorua, and the Southern Coalition, the Campbells from Wellington, and various Auckland relatives. Margaret had not anticipated the level of competitive intensity that cricket would generate. What she had envisioned as a gentle game suitable for mixed ages and abilities became a fierce battle that lasted well into the afternoon. Uncle Robert appointed himself captain of the Northern Alliance and approached the game with the strategic intensity of a military campaign. "This is war," he declared during a team huddle, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "The Campbells have been getting too big for their britches lately, and it's time we reminded them who the real athletes in this family are." The Southern Coalition, led by cousin James Campbell, responded with equal determination. James had played cricket at university and brought a level of technical skill that the Northern Alliance found both impressive and irritating. As the cricket match intensified, Margaret found herself in the unexpected role of referee, mediating disputes about rules, boundaries, and what constituted fair play. The game that was supposed to last an hour stretched into its third hour, with neither side willing to concede defeat. The turning point came when young Robert MacLeod, batting for the Northern Alliance, hit what appeared to be a clear boundary. However, cousin Elizabeth Campbell, fielding for the Southern Coalition, claimed the ball had been caught just inside the boundary line. The resulting argument involved not just the players but most of the spectators, and threatened to overshadow the entire day's festivities. Margaret realized that decisive action was required. "Enough," she called out. her voice carrying the authority that had made her the family's unofficial leader. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not a battlefield. I declare the match a draw, and anyone who disagrees can spend the rest of the day helping in the kitchen." The threat of kitchen duty proved more effective than any official ruling could have been. The cricket match was declared over, and both teams grudgingly agreed to share the victory. Uncle Robert grumbled about interference from the umpire, but his complaints were good-natured, and the competitive tension quickly dissolved into shared laughter about the intensity everyone had brought to what was supposed to be a casual game. The afternoon fishing competition provided a welcome change of pace. The lake at the edge of the Henderson property was well stocked with trout, and Margaret had hoped that fishing would offer a more peaceful activity for those who preferred quiet contemplation to athletic competition. She should have known better. Within an hour of the fishing competition's start, the lake shore had been divided into fiercely defended territories, with family members employing everything from traditional techniques to elaborate strategies involving multiple rods and complex bait combinations. Cousin David, whose Huawei injury made athletic competition difficult, proved to be a master angler, landing fish after fish with a skill that amazed and slightly annoyed his more athletic relative. "It's all about patience and understanding your quarry," he explained to young Tommy Campbell, who had been struggling with his line. "The fish don't care how fast you can run or how far you can throw a caber. They only care about whether you understand their world." The fishing competition produced the day's most unexpected moment when Aunt Flora, who had never shown any interest in angling, landed the largest fish of the day, a magnificent trout that required both Thomas and James MacLeod to help her bring to shore. Her triumph was made even sweeter by the fact that she had been using the simplest equipment and most basic technique, while the men around her employed increasingly complex strategies. "Sometimes," she said with a satisfied smile, as she held up her prize, "the old ways are the best ways." As evening approached and the day's competitions drew to a close, Margaret surveyed the scene with deep satisfaction. The lawn was scattered with the evidence of a day well spent: cricket equipment, Highland Games apparatus, fishing gear, and the general pleasant disorder that comes with any successful family gathering. The competitive spirit that had threatened to get out of hand during the cricket match had evolved into something more positive, a shared sense of accomplishment and family pride. Winners and losers alike seemed equally pleased with the day's events, and the stories from the competitions were already being embellished in the telling. "Well," Thomas said as he helped Margaret gather up the various ribbons and prizes, "I'd say day 2 has been every bit as successful as day 1, even if it wasn't quite what we expected." Margaret nodded, watching as family members gathered around Uncle Robert's barrel for what had become an evening tradition of storytelling and shared refreshment. Tomorrow would be the final day of the gathering, and she was already feeling a bittersweet anticipation of the farewells that would come. But tonight, with the competitions behind them and the evening stretching ahead, the Henderson family was exactly where Margaret had hoped they would be, together, happy and creating the kind of memories that would bind them across whatever distances and challenges the future might bring. Saturday morning brought with it an unexpected development that would transform the final day of the Henderson family gathering from a planned farewell into something far more significant. Margaret was in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of what she had intended to be a simple farewell breakfast, when the sound of multiple vehicles approaching up the drive caught her attention. Through the window, she could see not just one, but 3 motor cars making their way toward the house, followed by what appeared to be a hired omnibus. Her first thought was that some of the family members had arranged for transportation home earlier than expected, but as the vehicles drew closer, she realized that these were new arrivals, not departures. "Thomas," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "We have more guests coming up the drive." Quite a few more guests by the look of it. Thomas joined her at the window just as the first motor car came to a stop in front of the house. The door opened, and out stepped a figure that made Margaret gasp with surprise and delight, her brother William, whom she hadn't seen in over 2 years. "William," she cried, rushing out to greet him. "What on earth are you doing here? I thought you were still in Australia." William Henderson embraced his sister warmly, his weathered face creased in a grin. "I was, until I received your invitation forwarded through 3 different addresses. I couldn't miss a 3-day Henderson family party, could I? Besides, I brought some friends who were eager to meet the New Zealand branch of the family." As the other vehicles disgorged their passengers, Margaret realized that William had not come alone. The omnibus contained what appeared to be an entire family, the Andersons from Sydney, who were distant relatives through marriage. The other motor cars had brought additional Australian cousins, along with several family friends who had become honorary relatives over the years. "I hope you don't mind the invasion," William said, noting Margaret's slightly overwhelmed expression. "When word got around Sydney about your gathering, it seemed like half the expatriate New Zealand community wanted to come along. I tried to talk them out of it, but you know how persuasive Australian enthusiasm can be." Margaret looked at the growing crowd of new arrivals, at least 15 additional people, all looking expectant and cheerful, and felt a moment of panic. Her carefully planned 3-day gathering had already stretched her resources and organizational abilities. Adding 15 more people on the final day seemed like a recipe for disaster. But then she looked at William's hopeful face and at the excited expressions of the other arrivals, and realized that this unexpected expansion was exactly the kind of challenge that made family gatherings memorable. After all, wasn't the whole point to bring family together? And if that family happened to include a few more people than originally planned, well, that just made it more interesting. "Of course you're all welcome," she said, her voice warm despite her internal calculations. "We'll sort out the details. The important thing is that you're here." The arrival of the Australian contingent created a delightful chaos that energized the entire gathering. The original guests, who had been preparing for farewells and departures, suddenly found themselves with new people to meet and new stories to hear. The children were particularly excited by the arrival of several Australian cousins, close to their own ages. Uncle Robert, who had appointed himself the unofficial host of Camp MacLeod, immediately began organizing additional tent space for the new arrivals. "The more the merrier," they declared, directing the younger men in setting up what quickly became known as Camp Australia on the North Lawn. The Australian visitors had brought with them not just their luggage, but a collection of gifts and contributions that transformed the final day's planned simple farewell into an impromptu international celebration. There were bottles of Australian wine, exotic fruits that none of the New Zealand relatives had ever tasted, and a collection of Aboriginal artifacts that fascinated everyone. Dealing with unexpected guests at your family gathering, learn how to gracefully handle last-minute additions and turn potential stress into celebration opportunities. But the most significant contribution came from William himself, who had brought with him a collection of photographs and documents that would prove to be the day's most treasured discovery. As the extended family gathered for what had become a much larger breakfast than originally planned, William produced a leather portfolio that he had been carrying carefully since his arrival. "I've been doing some research into the family history," he announced, opening the portfolio on the main dining table. "And I've discovered some things that I think you'll all find interesting." The photographs were the first revelation. William had somehow managed to acquire images of the original Henderson homestead in Scotland, along with portraits of family members that no one in New Zealand had ever seen. There was a formal portrait of their grandparents on their wedding day, looking stern and dignified in their Victorian finery. There were pictures of the family farm in the Scottish Highlands, showing the landscape that their ancestors had left behind when they emigrated to New Zealand. But the most exciting discovery was a collection of letters that William had found in an old trunk in their grandmother's house in Sydney. The letters, written by various family members over the past 50 years, told the story of the Henderson family's dispersal across the Pacific and their efforts to maintain connections despite vast distances and difficult communications. "Listen to this," William said, holding up a letter dated 1865. This is from our Uncle James in Christchurch to our grandfather in Sydney. The family grows and prospers in this new land, but we must not forget that we are stronger together than apart. He proposes that we establish a tradition of regular gatherings, so that the bonds of family may not be weakened by the tyranny of distance. The letter created a moment of profound silence, as family members realized that their current gathering was not just Margaret's idea, but the fulfillment of a dream that had been articulated by their ancestors decades earlier. Cousin Elizabeth, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "So this gathering, what we're doing right now, it's what Uncle James wanted all those years ago. It appears so," William said, continuing to sort through the letters. "And there's more. It seems that there have been other attempts at family gatherings over the years, but they never quite worked out. This might be the first time the dream has actually been realized." The revelation transformed the atmosphere of the gathering from a pleasant family reunion into something approaching a historic occasion. Family members began to see their three-day picnic not just as Margaret's organization triumph, but as the culmination of generations of family aspiration. The morning's activities took on a different character as well. Instead of the planned farewell preparations, the day became an impromptu family history celebration. The Australian visitors shared stories of the family's experiences in Sydney and Melbourne, while the New Zealand relatives contributed their own tales of pioneering life and community building. Uncle Robert, inspired by the historical theme, began recounting stories that had been passed down from the earliest days of the family's arrival in New Zealand. It told of the challenges of clearing land, building homes, and establishing farms in a landscape that was both beautiful and unforgiving. He spoke of the Maori families who had helped the early settlers, sharing knowledge of local conditions and becoming lifelong friends and neighbors. Cousin Elizabeth contributed her own historical perspective, sharing what she had learned about the family's integration into New Zealand society and their contributions to their various communities. She had brought with her a collection of newspaper clippings that documented family achievements over the years: births, marriages, business successes, and community service. As the day progressed, what emerged was not just a collection of individual family stories, but a comprehensive narrative of the Henderson family's role in the development of New Zealand and Australia. The three-day gathering had become an accidental family history conference, with each participant contributing pieces to a larger story that none of them had fully understood before. The most moving moment came when David, who had been reluctant to discuss his war experiences, found himself sharing not just his own story, but placing it in the context of the family's larger narrative of service and sacrifice. He spoke of carrying letters from New Zealand relatives to Australian cousins he met in France, and of the comfort that family connections had provided during the darkest moments of the war. "We're not just individuals," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered family. "We're part of something larger. A story that began in Scotland, continued in New Zealand and Australia, and will go on long after we're gone. This gathering isn't just about having a good time together. It's about remembering who we are and where we come from." As evening approached, and the expanded family gathered for what had become a much grander farewell dinner than originally planned, Margaret reflected on how dramatically the weekend had evolved from her original vision. What she had conceived as a simply three-day picnic had become something approaching a family congress, complete with historical research, international representation, and a sense of occasion that none of them had anticipated. "You know," Thomas said as he helped her survey the scene, multiple tables set up across the lawn, family members from 3 countries sharing stories and laughter, children playing games that bridged cultural differences. "I think this might be the most important thing we've ever done." Margaret nodded, watching as William and Uncle Robert collaborated on organizing the family photographs into a comprehensive display. Tomorrow would bring the actual farewells, but tonight felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The 3-day Henderson family picnic had become exactly what Uncle James had envisioned in his 185 letter, a gathering that strengthened family bonds and created a foundation for future connections. And as Margaret looked around at the faces illuminated by lanterns and the warm glow of family fellowship, she knew that this weekend would indeed be remembered for the rest of their lives. Sunday morning arrived with an ominous change in the weather that would test every aspect of the Henderson family's resilience and resourcefulness. Margaret woke to the sound of wind rattling the windows and rain drumming against the roof with an intensity that immediately told her this was no ordinary shower. The storm that had been threatening on the horizon for the past day had arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it challenges that would transform the final day of the gathering from planned farewells into an unexpected test of family solidarity. Thomas was already up, standing at the bedroom window and surveying the scene outside with obvious concern. "Margaret," he said quietly, "we may have a problem. This storm looks like it's settling in for the duration, and some of those tents aren't going to survive much more of this wind." Margaret joined him at the window and immediately understood the scope of the challenge they faced. The carefully organized camps on the north and south lawns were being battered by wind and rain that had already collapsed one of the smaller tents and was threatening several others. In the gray dawn light, she could see family members struggling to secure their temporary shelters while being soaked by the driving rain. "We need to get everyone inside," Margaret said, her mind already racing through the logistics. The house, the barn, the guest cottage, anywhere with a solid roof. What followed was a masterpiece of family cooperation under pressure. Within an hour, the Henderson property had been transformed into an emergency shelter operation that would have impressed any military quartermaster. Uncle Robert, despite his 70 years, took charge of the evacuation from Camp MacLeod with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with frontier emergencies for decades. Right then, he called out over the wind, "Everyone grab what you can carry and head for the house. We'll sort out the rest later." The Australian visitors, who had been camping in the more exposed North Lawn area, found themselves being shepherded toward the barn by a committee of New Zealand cousins who treated the emergency evacuation as just another family activity requiring organization and cooperation. William Henderson, who had survived Australian droughts and floods, proved particularly valuable in organizing the emergency response. "In situations like this," he told young Robert MacLeod, as they worked together to salvage camping equipment, "the key is to stay calm and remember that material things can be replaced, but family cannot." The house, which had seemed spacious enough for the original gathering, suddenly felt quite cozy with 50-plus family members seeking shelter from the storm. Margaret found herself coordinating sleeping arrangements that would have challenged a hotel manager, while Aunt Flora took charge of feeding the expanded indoor population with whatever supplies could be gathered from the various camps before they were completely soaked. Learn how to turn unexpected challenges into opportunities for deeper family bonding. Discover emergency hosting tips that can save any gathering from weather disasters. The storm's intensity created an enforced intimacy that might not have developed under normal circumstances. Family members who had been maintaining polite social distances found themselves sharing close quarters and working together on practical problems. The Australian cousins, who had been somewhat peripheral to the established family dynamics, suddenly became integral to the group's survival and comfort. Cousin Sarah, with her nursing background, appointed herself Chief of Health and Safety, ensuring that everyone who had been soaked in the evacuation was properly dried and warmed. She set up a medical station in the parlor and conducted a systematic check of all family members, paying particular attention to the elderly and the children. "Hypothermia is nothing to joke about," she announced with professional authority, "and I'm not having anyone getting sick on my watch." The children, who might have been expected to be upset by the disruption of their outdoor adventures, instead treated the storm as the ultimate adventure. Led by young Tommy Campbell, they organized elaborate games of hide-and-seek throughout the house and created an intricate fort system using furniture and blankets that impressed even the adults. As the morning progressed and the storm showed no signs of abating, the family began to adapt to their confined circumstances with remarkable creativity. The dining room became a central gathering place where Uncle Robert continued his storytelling, now with an audience that included the Australian relatives who were hearing many of the family legends for the first time. William Henderson contributed his own stories of family life in Australia, creating a fascinating contrast between the New Zealand and Australian experiences of the same family tradition. The enforced closeness allowed for conversations that might never have happened under normal circumstances, as family members found themselves sharing experiences and perspectives across generational and geographical divides. The most significant development came when cousin Elizabeth, inspired by the previous day's historical discoveries, suggested that the storm-enforced gathering provided the perfect opportunity to create a comprehensive family record. "We're all here," she pointed out, "including people who might not be together again for years. Why don't we use this time to document everything we've learned and experienced?" What began as a simple suggestion evolved into an ambitious family history project that engaged nearly everyone in the house. The Australian visitors contributed their knowledge of the family's experiences across the Tasman, while the New Zealand relatives shared their stories of pioneering life and community development. David, who had been reluctant to discuss his war experiences in detail, found himself in conversation with several Australian cousins who had also served in France. The shared experience of military service created bonds that transcended the geographical divisions within the family, and their conversations provided insights into the war's impact on families across the Pacific. Uncle Robert, energized by having such an engaged audience, began recounting family stories with unprecedented detail and accuracy. The enforced indoor gathering had created the perfect conditions for oral history preservation, and family members found themselves learning things about their heritage that had never been formally recorded. The storm also revealed unexpected talents and resources within the family group. Cousin James Campbell, who had seemed primarily interested in cricket and competition, proved to be an accomplished musician who could play both piano and violin. His impromptu concerts in the parlor provided entertainment that helped pass the long hours of confinement. Aunt Flora, working with the Australian visitors who had brought exotic ingredients, created meals that were both practical and celebratory. The enforced cooperation in the kitchen broke down social barriers and created working relationships that enriched the entire gathering. As afternoon turned to evening and the storm continued to rage outside, the family began to realize that what had initially seemed like a disaster was actually providing them with something precious: uninterrupted time together without the distractions of planned activities or the pressure of scheduled departures. "You know," Margaret said to Thomas as they surveyed the scene in their transformed home, "this might be the best thing that could have happened to us." The house was full of conversation, laughter, and the comfortable chaos of a large family making the best of challenging circumstances. Every room contained small groups engaged in different activities: storytelling, music, games, or simply quiet conversation. The storm had created an intimacy and cooperation that might have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. John Robert MacLeod, who had proven to be a natural leader during the emergency evacuation, made an observation that captured the mood of the entire gathering. "This storm isn't stopping our family gathering, it's making it better. We're not just visiting with each other anymore, we're really living together, even if it's just for a day." As evening approached and the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, the family faced a new challenge. None of them particularly wanted the enforced togetherness to end. The 3-day picnic that had been planned as a pleasant family reunion had evolved into something far more significant: a genuine family community that had been forged by shared challenges and mutuals. The storm had done more than test their practical resourcefulness. It had revealed the depth of connection and cooperation that was possible when the Henderson family worked together toward common goals. As they prepared for what they now knew would be a very different kind of farewell than originally planned, each family member carried with them the knowledge that they were part of something larger and stronger than they had previously understood. The 3-day Henderson family picnic was about to conclude, but the family itself had been fundamentally strengthened by the experience. The storm that had threatened to ruin their gathering had instead provided the final element needed to transform a pleasant reunion into a defining family experience that would influence relationships and decisions for generations to come. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself was apologizing for the previous day's dramatic interruption. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that sparkled with fresh rain and the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem newly created. Margaret stood on her front porch, surveying the aftermath of what had become the most extraordinary family gathering in Henderson family history, and marveled at how completely the weekend had exceeded every expectation she had dared to hold. The lawn was scattered with the debris of the storm, collapsed tents, scattered camping equipment, and the general disorder that comes with any natural disaster. But the family members who emerged from the house that morning seemed energized rather than discouraged by the challenges they had faced together. The enforced intimacy of the storm had created bonds that were already evident in the easy cooperation with which everyone set about the task of cleaning up and preparing for the inevitable farewells. Uncle Robert, who had somehow managed to maintain his authority and good humor throughout the crisis, organized the younger men into cleanup crews with the efficiency of a seasoned commander. "Right then, lads," he called out, "let's get this place sorted so Margaret doesn't have to spend the next month cleaning up after us." The Australian visitors who had originally planned to depart on Sunday found themselves with an extra day that none of them seemed eager to end. William Henderson, in particular, seemed reluctant to begin the long journey back to Sydney, and Margaret suspected that the weekend had reminded him of connections he hadn't realized he was missing. "You know, Margaret," he said as they worked together to sort through the salvaged camping equipment, "I've been thinking about what Uncle James wrote in that letter about the importance of regular family gatherings. Maybe we shouldn't wait another generation to make this happen again." The idea that had been forming in several minds throughout the weekend suddenly found its voice. Cousin Elizabeth, who had been documenting the weekend's events with the thoroughness of a professional historian, looked up from her notes and made a suggestion that would transform the Henderson family's future. "What if we made this an annual tradition?" she said. "Not necessarily 3 days every time, but a regular gathering that rotates between different family locations. Next year Australia, the year after that, perhaps Christchurch, then back to Auckland." The suggestion was met with immediate enthusiasm from family members who had been dreading the return to their scattered lives. The weekend had demonstrated not just the possibility of large-scale family cooperation, but the genuine pleasure and benefit that came from sustained contact across generational and geographical lines. Thomas, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics throughout the weekend, made a practical observation that helped crystallize the emerging consensus. "We've proven that we can organize something like this. We've also proven that we can handle unexpected challenges and still have a wonderful time together. Why wouldn't we want to do it again?" The planning session that developed over breakfast was as enthusiastic and detailed as any business meeting. Family members volunteered to host future gatherings, suggested improvements based on the weekend's experiences, and began establishing the organizational structure that would be needed to coordinate regular events across such vast distances. Uncle Robert, despite his age, volunteered to serve as the family's official historian and record keeper, maintaining correspondence between gatherings and ensuring that family news and updates reached everyone. William Henderson agreed to coordinate the Australian participation, while Margaret accepted the role of overall organizer for the rotating gatherings. "We'll need to be more systematic about planning," Margaret said, her organizational instincts already engaged with the new challenge. "Better advance notice, clearer communication about what people should bring, and definitely contingency plans for weather emergencies." But even as they discussed practical improvements, everyone understood that the weekend's most important achievements couldn't be planned or organized. The sense of family solidarity that had emerged during the storm, the historical connections that had been discovered and documented, and the personal relationships that had been strengthened or newly formed, these were the real treasures of the gathering, and they couldn't be replicated through better logistics alone. Cousin David, whose participation in the weekend had marked an important step in his recovery from his war experiences, made an observation that captured the deeper significance of what they had accomplished. "This weekend has reminded me of something I learned in France," he said. "The most important battles aren't always the ones you plan for. Sometimes the most important victories come from simply standing together when things get difficult." The farewells, when they finally began, were unlike any family departure Margaret had ever witnessed. Instead of the hurried, slightly awkward goodbyes that typically marked the end of family visits, these farewells carried the weight of genuine commitment and shared purpose. Family members were not just saying goodbye. They were making promises about future contact and participation in the newly established tradition. The Australian visitors were the first to depart, their motor cars loaded not just with luggage, but with gifts, photographs and copies of the family documents that William had brought. The exchange of addresses and promises to write was conducted with the seriousness of diplomatic negotiations, as everyone understood that maintaining the connections forged during the weekend would require sustained effort and commitment. Uncle Robert and the MacLeod contingent were next to leave, their wagon once again loaded with family members and the accumulated treasures of the weekend. But their departure felt more like a temporary separation than a farewell, as they had already committed to hosting the following year's gathering at their Hamilton property. "You've started something important here, Margaret," Uncle Robert said, as he prepared to climb onto the wagon's driver's bench. "Something that our ancestors would be proud of, and something that our descendants will thank us for." The Campbells from Wellington departed with similar promises and commitments, their motor car carrying not just passengers, but the responsibility for maintaining the southern branch of the family's participation in the new tradition. Cousin Elizabeth had already begun planning a comprehensive family newsletter that would keep everyone connected between gatherings. As the last of the guests departed and the Henderson property returned to its normal quiet, Margaret and Thomas found themselves alone for the first time in 4 days. The house, which had seemed almost impossibly crowded during the storm, now felt almost empty, and the silence was both peaceful and slightly melancholy. "Well," Thomas said, settling into his favorite chair on the front porch, "I'd say your 3-day picnic was a complete success, even if it didn't go quite according to plan." Margaret joined him on the porch, looking out over the lawn, where the evidence of the weekend's activities was still visible in the trampled grass, and the areas where tents had been erected. "You know, Thomas, I think the fact that it didn't go according to plan might be exactly why it was so successful." As they sat together in the peaceful aftermath of the gathering, Margaret reflected on the weekend's lessons about family, planning, and the unexpected ways that challenges could become opportunity. She had organized the gathering with specific goals in mind, bringing family together, creating pleasant memories, and strengthening family bonds. All of those goals had been achieved, but in ways that were far more profound and lasting than she had originally envisioned. The storm that had threatened to ruin the final day had instead provided the catalyst for the deepest level of family cooperation and connection. The unexpected arrival of the Australian relatives had transformed a pleasant reunion into an international family congress. The competitive activities that had threatened to get out of hand had evolved into shared celebrations of family achievement and character. Most importantly, the weekend had established not just memories, but structures and commitments that would continue to strengthen family connections for years to come. The Henderson family had not just enjoyed a successful gathering, they had created a tradition that would influence family relationships across generations. As evening approached and the New Zealand countryside settled into its familiar rhythms, Margaret and Thomas began planning improvements to their property that would accommodate future gatherings. The 3-day picnic had become an annual commitment, and they wanted to be ready for whatever challenges and opportunities the next gathering might bring. The Henderson family's 3-day picnic of 1920 had ended, but its influence on the family's future had only just begun. In years to come, family members would measure other gatherings against the standard set during that remarkable weekend in Auckland, and the stories from those 3 days would be told and retold until they became part of the family's foundational metal. Margaret's simple idea for a family picnic had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration of the power of family commitment, the importance of maintaining connections across distance and time, and the unexpected ways that shared challenges could strengthen rather than weaken family bonds. The three-day picnic that had lasted exactly 3 days had created memories and traditions that would last for generations. The Henderson family gatherings continued annually for the next 15 years, rotating between New Zealand and Australia as planned. The tradition was interrupted by the Second World War, but resumed in 1947 and continues to this day, now organized by the fourth and fifth generations of the family. Margaret's original guest list and the letters discovered by William Henderson are preserved in the family archives, serving as reminders of the vision and commitment that created one of the most enduring family traditions in the Pacific region. The three-day picnic of 1920 is still remembered as the gathering that established the template for all future Henderson family reunions. Expect the unexpected, prepare for challenges, and never underestimate the power of family solidarity in the face of adversity.